All right, so now I think I've hit the record button. So welcome everybody. This is technically the week 4 office hours for Seeing Through the World. And as mentioned, Cynthia and I were in conversation many weeks ago about having or holding a conversation here with you all and between us. Long time in the making. Very happy to have Cynthia Bourgeault be joining us today. And with the format we're going to be doing, a little bit different than previous weeks, since I think the group is going to be a little bit bigger, but also I want to prioritize all of the students who are taking the Gebser course right now. We're in week 4 of 5, or entering into week 5. And so, Cynthia, you and I are going to riff for a bit. We're going to talk a little bit about different themes and things that have been on our mind here. Particularly, I'd love to talk a bit about the Gebser series you've been posting on Substack, which have a lot of thoughts on that and reflections on that. And I'm sure many of us do as well. Then we're going to open it up to initial round of student questions. So I'll be sort of screening for student inquiries. Have you guys all participate first, just in terms of asking questions. Then we'll open it up to everybody else and see how much time we got. We're hosting the normal amount of time too. So we'll be going, I don't know, as long as you have time, but within the frame of 90 minutes, we usually go, Cynthia. So welcome, Cynthia. It's great to have you here with us. All right. So where to begin? I have two things for me that are probably most alive, right? One is, I think, just in a sort of heartfelt way and sort of an aesthetic feeling tone way, I think your recent post, the Gebserian take, and the series that have followed from that, is really living in me in terms of, what is to be done. How do we respond to a time of interregnum? How do we live through that, right? Particularly for those of us who have a contemplative orientation, right? Um, I really appreciated the framing of the contemplative movement. Maybe one note about that too is Gebser's book was translated into English into the Anglican world in the 1980s as well. So we have this kind of cultural pulse or wave with a spiritual inclination. And I can't help but think of, folks like William Ern Thompson who talk about this, right? That in the process of planetization, where we have a problematic emphasis on technology, the mystic is also perhaps has a role in this as well, right? That the mystical and contemplative dimension, or the dimension of consciousness, is sort of a response to technologization, and the two kind of have this tension in the process of the emerging planetary culture. So that's kind of my framing for today, is just really thinking about how do we really live into a time of interregnum, and what's the role of the contemplative, or those with a spiritual orientation, in really kind of witnessing, right, this crisis, really staying with the trouble, as Donna Haraway talks about. What is our role here, in this process? And there's so much more, but maybe I'll kind of open it there for any initial thoughts, Cynthia.
Well, thank you. And I took that on. I think I had to say, and just as a backdrop, that I came to Gebser during COVID. Uh, as a matter of fact, my homework was during the time when we were all hung up high and dry with COVID, staying in our house, was to plow through the book. Uh, and I have to say that for me, it was an absolute page turner. It was a book that I had been uh, waiting all my life to see that my own education. I'd gone to a very very good, well prepared prep school with a lot of European teachers teaching in it, and I had a huge dose of the backdrop of Western civilization, and to watch Gebser just weaving from an enormous base of elucidation and insight and brilliance, albeit with a Western sort of philosophical and a skew to it, that it was just so exciting and so gratifying to me, and such a relief to escape from the kind of individual developmental maps that have most sort of popularly grown out of this nowadays. And it's basically that Gebser has made his passage into pop culture in a pretty much reductionistic version of was there. Uh, that has real emphasis on individual childhood development as the basis of it. And so to read it in its original psycho-spiritual cultural context against the background of the ages and the real kind of shifts, mutations in human culture, in human civilization, not in personal development, was for me a huge gift. It almost brought me to my knees in the awe and wonder of the whole thing. So, uh, long story short, in that, it was always in the backdrop to me that what I loved about this was it was so practical under all the kind of esoteric trappings. It gave a marvelous roadmap that had for me just about the right scope and dimension for bringing a longer range and a more kind of collective perspective to issues towards the evolution of consciousness. And so it was a tool that once I put it in my pocket, I never took it out. I had to get a pants with way bigger pockets because there's so much there. But but there it was, just waiting to happen. Now, so from the contemplative side, I've worked in the contemplative sort of side of things all my life, but I got off to a very, very good start with it from the Quakers. Thank heavens I had that in my background. Uh, I was sent to Quaker school, and I grew up here and right around the Philadelphia area where the Quakers first landed on the American shores, and they were a religion that never, ever separated mystical vision from what you might call prophetic witness. To think that you could put them in two camps like contemplation in the right hand and action in the left just didn't make sense to them because they were coming from a whole cloth. I guess that what you would see is all. I bet that if you scratched inside the brain of some of the great Quaker divines, what you would see is diaphaneity big time. They simply saw. They simply saw in a unified knowing that connected heart, mind, that had that sort of instantaneous thing. You didn't have to logic and deduce. You just saw that two and two were four. And that you didn't separate then, and that action that came from mystical seeing would by nature be prophetic action because mystical seeing diaphanous consciousness, and I think that all mystical consciousness at its high point is integral seeing. Uh, I've never seen a mystic that operated at less than the integral level of consciousness, uh, exemplified through the heart, and so there's this seeing, there's this profound seeing of the state of the world, but it's contained also in the radiance from which that seeing emerges. So it tends to be non-judgmental, non-righteous. It doesn't get tripped up in blame. Uh, one of my one of my most powerful instances of when I started looking at martyrs, beginning with St. Stephen, the reputed first Christian who to be stoned to death for his witness to Jesus. But when he gives his testimony, it's not like he's witnessing to Jesus so he can go to heaven. He's already in heaven and is speaking from that place. So he's never saying, you nasty people, why are you hurting me? He's saying, I see the heavens open, I see the Lord, I see the glory. And the same with the Quakers who got hanged in early Boston Common for being Quakers and not Puritans. Uh, and their testimony is just of a radiance, of an absolutely interpenetrating radiance out of which they can only speak in joy. So I was always kind of confused after that kind of Quaker immersion in unified action and seeing, why when I got to the sort of Catholic side of the wing where I met my great contemplative teachers, there was such an issue around contemplation being one path and action being another. I just never really got it. But this was very, very important, and the people that were being seriously trained to develop this kind of deeper, what I would call integral or unitive or diaphanous seeing vision, uh, rigorously separated themselves from the world. The monasteries, the contemplative traditions, built cloisters around themselves so that you didn't have to be bothered by the world. And if any of you ever read Thomas Merton's sort of passages when he leaves the nasty, sin laden world behind and enters the beautiful white monastery at Gethsemane, it's very much let the world stew in its own juices while I attend to my soul. And there have been some profound people in the Western Catholic tradition that have tried to heal this artificial and totally mental structure uh, uh, generated dichotomy. Uh, but it still is tricky. And every time I speak out politically or with any sort of way about hot topic, I can always predict that at least 10% of the contemplatives are going to tell me how disappointed they are that I'm getting my feet dirty in the world and that I should tend to the world of prayer. And there's a great feeling that to actually put your feet on the ground and make a witness in this world is somehow to betray a contemplative vocation. Uh, and again, I believe that that's because most of our teaching on contemplation and action has been generated in the mental structure of consciousness with its insistence on taking what used to be polarities and dividing them into dialectics. And in reality, what happens is that contemplation, deep silence spills over through the heart into action, and then action comes back into the silence to find its clarity and its clarification, like dust settling. And then the heart kicks in and sends you out again. So you're always sort of doing that oceanic approach. Uh, but as soon as you get a mental structure of consciousness that says, well, contemplation on the left and action on the right, one or the other, what tychology are you are, you've just wrecked the possibility for enlightened action. And so when it came around to the Gebser post today, and I found myself then really impaled myself because everything in me said, uh, what's going on in the country today is a massive infusion of elements, whether you want to call them evil according to the modern, the classic moral terminologies, or whether you call them a paroxysm of repressed magic and mystic structure that have been artificially repressed and kept down by a mentally generated civilization. You can play it either way. But so what we needed was witness. What we needed was compassionate witness and the energy that comes out of people who are really trying to work from a more integral level of consciousness, but have not in the process abandoned the call to compassionate witness. So it just seemed to me that people were getting stuck. I was seeing the marvelous regeneration of resolve and the buck stops here. A lot of it come out of the atrocities that were committed in Minnesota during the ice raids. People finally said enough is enough, and you watch a movement beginning to start. But uh, but at the same time, that unless it can somehow weave out and intertwine with people that are really tending and trying to come at it, bringing not only a higher perspective, but a capacity to act out of the spiritual wholeness that emerges out of that higher perspective. Until you can do that, it's just going to be more sort of burnout and whiplash, and the top dog is now bottom, and the bottom dog is now top. So my wish was to try to unite a little bit more, get get people that have been huddling in little quarters to talk about mutation, and people that have been out on the battlefield to get together and cross pollinate and hold the world as we walk. I mean, we haven't progressed from what Gebser was telling us nearly 75 years ago. The scenarios that he was seeing in the times of Hitler are replaying today. Uh, and I know that ground has been laid and good ground, and that it's now our turn, our time to plant the seeds in that ground. Uh, so the first step I thought was to simply put the Gebserian paradigm out there so that people would stop cinching up on the bat and thinking that this was a political thing that came out of reactions to Roosevelt, the New Deal, and whatever, uh, but that it has a place on the cusp of the grinding of the tectonic plates of two structures of consciousness against each other in the inevitable position of the world. How can we take that in and be present in our own times from the basis of that wider perspective? So that's that's way too much of a dump to get us started. But Jeremy, I'll turn it over back over to you to take it where you want.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Thank you, Cynthia. There's a lot. Yes, there's a lot here, but I think it's a good template to kind of open with. The first point, just about the kind of uh, in class, we were talking about the different forms of thinking. The mental structure, of course, kind of has these oppositions, right? The subject object opposition. But earlier, let's say the mental mythical cusp had this more oceanic thinking as you're speaking to. So that complementarity of opposites was more present. And exactly as you're describing, this sort of contemplative inward breath, and then there's an exhalation, right? There's a going back out into the world, and they were seen as a continuum. One flowed into the other as a kind of rhythm. And that's very much been on my mind too, in terms of the context of our present. How do we return or retrieve opposites or polarities in a way that's not merely or just explicitly the mythical complementarity, right, or the polarity, but in a way that kind of holds in a more ecological sense, a sort of a multi-bundling, right, of different polarities that are in tension together, that are generative, right, that unfold and continue to transform and not in a fixed sense. So that's just sort of, at the outset here, but I think what's very clear in Gebser, as I'm hearing you describe what was clear in the Quakers, is this sense that a mutation in consciousness is necessarily going to mean, that out breath, right? That if we have a different relationship to time in the present, the shaping of our world, our material conditions, the way in which we do or don't emphasize labor, the way in which we relate to the natural world or have a sense of rootedness or not, the cultural expressions of that, everything is in a sense up for grabs in the mutational transition, right? We're going to have a new relationship with the world, and the worlding, the social realities we create will transform as a result of a new relationship with time. So he has this really interesting, a statement that I sort of inspired one of the chapters. I think it's the one I had sent to you on reclaiming time, right? That where he talks about, talking about the new integral consciousness. And he says, well, doesn't, our modern lifestyle, the factory and the office, and he says the senselessness of labor and automation and mechanization, doesn't all this get in the way of the new consciousness? And he says, well, on the contrary, all the more clearly, if we were to live, and have this insight and with respect to this integral time, all the more clearly will the false form of time's eruption, this sort of mechanization of the self and the atomization of the world, all the more clearly will that be evident, right? And expressed in the sort of emptiness of motoricity and the scramble for worthless goods. And he's like, our social reality is our creation, right? And we've, in a certain sense, allowed it to kind of run off out of control. But if we were to really live the new time and live the present, a relational present, to really live this integral time would mean to transform our world. So Gebser, I think, throughout EPO and throughout his writing, has that sense that these are an integral whole. Like we have to see them as an integral whole or transparent to each other, that a new consciousness means a new social reality. And so, the contemplative or, someone who's gaining some sense of spiritual insight with respect to the integral, there's this question, and it's sort of an ethical imperative in that sense. Maybe there's a better way to frame it, right? To transform, their social realities, to create zones in where the future is present, right? And that sort of gets into my own concept of reclaiming time, but very Gebserian and informed at least, or inspired. So there's that, right? And maybe the other aspect here is just, the I think the question, right? Like, if I can put this in a good way, with respect to like what you were speaking about the sort of the decline of institutional structures, and this question of what the role of you know the contemplative is in watching our institutions unravel. How do we kind of lean into the efficient insights of the integral, bearing compassionate witness, and then also perhaps having a role to play, and at least presencing and bringing forward that spiritual energy and insight, not to kind of get caught up in ego inflation as like, okay, we're the leaders now, or we're the folks with the better ideas, but more to kind of get our hands in the dirt, right, and be involved in that process, to see that process as transparent to that inward insight. I think that's the question for me, right? Something Gebser talks about sort of just passingly, but in a very important way, where he talks about the enslavement to the nation state, to nationalism particularly, where he says, I have this in my notes, right? Nationalism is a prototypical of three-dimensional thinking. To consider us as an offering of a nation is to perceive the nature and ways of one's own nation as being an enduring ideal. And this, he says, is a static and three-dimensional and perspectival and fixed conception. And yet, on the basis of this, he says, we should really be seeing ourselves as dynamic efflorescences of a larger cultural context. So, seeing us as more process oriented, perhaps to borrow from Whitehead, right? So what would that look like? And this question of, I think we need to, pay attention with this poetic and heartfelt sense that you express in your writings, to bear witness and not look away. But I think in that, there's in the bearing witness and not looking away, I think we also begin to intuit where the new is possible, right? It's like it's in that where we start to have that sense, and where, the dying of the old structure is also giving us lessons, right, as to what the shape of this new structure could be and look like, and how we might begin to live it. We have to be in relationship with the dying and the birthing in order to be informed by that process and to really live that process, right? We have to be in present to it, in relationship with it, right? So, my last point is just that, this question of what survives the old, and what is reborn in the new. I think democratic institutions themselves have a much older history than ancient Greece, right? They've arisen in multiple times and multiple mutational histories around the planet. So this gives me hope, at least, that I think in our unique historical context, in the context of Western civilization, liberal Enlightenment values, representative institutions, these might in the end be replaced without falling entirely into, tyranny and violence. That there might be more dynamic modes of democratic, governments, more participatory. That there might be more, is what Le Guin, Ursula K. Le Guin talks about, right, with her example of, civilizations, they all wish to like kind of live forever and endure, right? But by doing that, they become brittle, they become rigid, and then they die. But when she looks at the forest and she says, well, the forest knows how to die, right? So, and it dies again and again and again. And so it lives forever, right? So perhaps there's some wisdom in this, and in for us in sort of witnessing what's happening now, right? Not as a finality, but as sort of a turning over, a controlled burn, witnessing what's happening as a necessary one, right? That will be of happening of itself anyway, right? This transition is going to happen. The dying away is going to happen. So it's up to us to like lean into, what is fecund in the ashes and the pine cones. What are the new things that are growing and keeping themselves alive long enough? And how can we help that process to keep things alive long enough for to be something like a planetary future, right? That is my sense of where I'm hearing you share in these articles, where to go, where to lean our energy into, is to really be witness for what's coming up in the ashes, right? What's living here in the dying, in order for the future to take that much more root, right? Or it means we have to keep looking. We have to put our creative energy into those inquiries and our awareness into those intensities in order to cohere the spiritual, what's imminent in this process. Anyway, so those are my own kind of long thoughts on your article. Any thinking on that?
Well,
Yeah.
no, yeah, and let's see if I can do this without taking it off track. But as I've long since, I've been learning from the two G's. I mean, the on the one hand there's Gebser, and then there's the other hand there's this long-standing relationship I've had with Gurdjieff and the Gurdjieff work. And from the moment that I put the two of them together, I realized that they're you know they're in some ways pairs and partners. I mean, and Gebser had no real awareness of Gurdjieff at all, and he had not much to say about Uspensky, who's the usual interpretive access to it. But I think it's a real missed opportunity because there's so many things that work together brilliantly. And my biggest startle when I was writing that last post was to realize that what what Gebser is imagining as the different characteristics between the mental structure of consciousness and the newfound capaciousness of the integral pretty much exactly matched the different stages and causalities and properties that Gurdjieff describes in terms of his own remake of the great chain of being, his ray of creation, as the imaginal world and the and the world, the mental world, the rational world that we have. And this is, he called them World 24 and World 2048 because they talked about how many, the numbers refer to how many kind of laws and conditions and constrictions they were under. Bottom line is that what Gebser describes as integral and what Gurdjieff describes as imaginal or World 24 uh, are basically you're looking at the same job description. You're looking at the same qualities, you're looking at the same strength, you're looking at the same mode of seeing, and the middle structure of consciousness precisely matches with this world that we've created, this Western civilization world we've created, reflecting its principles. Linear, causal, sequential, dialectical, the and I thought, wow, what I draw from this is that higher world called it World 24 has is imbued with a greater quality of being. In other words, and I don't think that Gebser ever dwelled on being. It's a term that we really got from from Gurdjieff, from the Buddhists, from people who've actually lived inside their soul from a deeper awareness. But there is a force of being in people that can live the integral. It's not just the new middle software you put on. It's a very pervasive hardwiring that the upgrade of the whole system. And and what it means is that people even at rest, you know, even by doing nothing but barely witnessing, when they're witnessing out of an imaginal or a world 24 or an integral being, uh, bear with them a greater implicit force and vibrational frequency. And the sheer act of witnessing is also a transmission uh, that 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 many of the great mystical writers began to understand, and Gurdjieff was among them, that that things like faith, hope, and love are not just nice qualities. Uh, they are actual subtle spiritual substances that we can't touch in this world with a rational mind. It's too dense, but they do have motility in the higher worlds, and that we're really working in the movement of this world to to a new operating system is really an upgrade on a whole level of not only of consciousness but of being. And the reason it's so important to stay present to that and to work with it in ourselves is because as we can begin to be stable in this and transmit, give and receive, build webs of spiritual energy like collective alchemists, it becomes possible to direct, this kind of energy, the kind of radiant energy that's accessible to people as part of the real installation of the integral program is that instantaneous, action at a distance, instantaneous action, a chiastic kind of causality that things radiate out from a center, which is exactly what Gebser is talking about by calling the book the ever present origin. The origin is the center from which things radiate out. And and we can, as we access integral consciousness, we have both the intellectual framework, but also the being to handle causality at this higher level of vibration. I really think that that's a lot of what he means by the intensification of time. Uh, so that means that what we're doing is not trying to just sort of witness like the parquet boxes at an opera to a higher level of consciousness. It's to already be magnetized by that, and whether you're eating or sleeping or whatever you're doing, uh, to gather and walk with that energy. That the integral is not going to emerge from the future. It's going to emerge from the intensification of the now in a new form of being consciousness. So it's not just an idle witnessing. And it imparts a huge different feeling to it than a lot of what I just tear my hair out in the what I call the last upwellings of the spiritual contemplative vision generated by the mental structure of consciousness. The latest thing that's popular around here. These are folks that are good people and everything. Some of my close friends, but they're still running the mental structure of consciousness, which is perceiving in terms of dialectic and difference and either or and well, and so we've got this great thing now that the word duality has been stolen. And whenever anybody is saying, well, we ought to act, somebody's always saying, well, you're being dual now. I'm trying to be non dual. And, it's kind of hilarious because they take non duality, which is kind of the Eastern Asian equivalent for what we mean by integral. By what we mean, the ability to really hold the whole thing without minimizing the pieces, but without getting distracted by it. Uh, they take that and instead they have to, because they're using the mental structure of consciousness, they split it up. There's a good guy called dual or non-dual. There's a bad guy called dual. And whenever you're calling attention to any kind of moral interest or any kind of when you're saying that is not on, oh, you're being dual. it's kind of it's kind of uh, I don't know. I have enough of a love of the theater of the absurd that the whole thing, when it's not like chalk on a blackboard, and fingernails on a blackboard, for me, it's hilarious. You're being dual, but no, 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 no. We have to not be afraid. Yes, of course, when you're in the integral, you are going to see the warts. And you're going to not be afraid to name the warts, and you're not going to be able to say that this violates the face of God. But you're going to do it from a way that's not an either or, good guys, bad guys, blame kind of way. You're going to see it, do it like two and two is four. Simple, obvious truth. So that wanders around the barn, but I want to say that a lot of the work that needs to be done, if the decision is made in some sense to really commit and prioritize the continued cultivation of the new consciousness, because that's where everything is going to shift again. And to do what we must to tend the old structures, to midwife responsibly, to speak truth to power where we must, but still keeping our eye on the new becoming and forming cells like this one where people know the language and yearn from that kind of corner of the being to make something happen that helps prepare the place for the new to alight and take root. And I think that's the primary responsibility of conscious groups, but they don't do that by sequestering themselves, but uh, by breathing in and collecting together and then going out into the world as living seeds of the new.
Yeah, uh, beautifully stated. I really am resonant with this sense that witnessing something, you said, witnessing is also a kind of transmission, right?
Mm-hmm.
As you're saying, faith, hope, and love, they're not just qualities, but they're spiritual substances. And to kind of give them a process or a temporal element too, right? They are events, right? This is something that Gebser picks up on when he says, poetry is the history of the dateless, but also that, participating in the reading of poetry, that poetry itself is an event
Mhm.
in a mutational event in the history of consciousness, that it is an event beyond sort of the events that we have in our chronology, our historical chronology. But for me, this means, right, that poetic events in the history of consciousness, it's by, as you're saying, leaning into the new and getting a sense of what it qualitatively is, right? Beginning to live it in our being, that this is an event, right? This living by the new is a realization and an achievement in and of itself. And intensifying the new is part of that event, that mutational event. And as you're saying, the sort of building of these webs or networks where that spiritual energy is present becomes a kind of catalytic event, right? It grows its tendrils out in the present. It becomes transformative, right? Particularly communities that don't make that distinction or dichotomy too polarized between the inside and the outside, but they see them in a more transparent. I think that in itself allows for the intensity of the new to begin living and unfolding and becoming, right, as a physical way of life, right, and a spiritual one, something that sees that as a transparent. Um, so the spiritual import of this, I think, is so important, and something in my own writing I call the Chironic knot kind of just feels resonant with this, and it's sort of a poetic term that I have for what Gebser's talking about, and perhaps what you're speaking about here too, right? That the a Chironic knot is a kind of spiritual event. It's a mutational event, and it's something that keeps happening, like origin, right? It's ever present. It's still in the making, and we turn to it again and again, and unfold different facets of it again and again. And it's something that we can see as an event that's distributed across space and time, where it's present, where it becomes present in other communities, in conversations, right? The event is happening, the event is intensifying. And again, we're seeing it in the sort of playful sense as a distributed event. Um, and this sort of, it brings to mind the other aspect that you mentioned too, right? That this all has to do, on top of just witnessing and being present to the new and living it as a form of being in the present, also means, the fruit of that means what? It means to some degree, um, finding ways in which the old structures, so quote unquote the past, can live efficiently, can be restored to some degree, or can be embraced in their effective and efficient modes, right? In addition to, or in tandem with, in synergy with living the new. Part of this looks like, and our class has been talking about this quite a bit, that this forward reversal or this back leap from the future into the present, to really living the new in the present, also means, the shape of the future, a lot of it looks like healthy integration, effective restoration of previous structures through the spiritual being of the new, right? The spiritual event of the new. The cultivation of the new consciousness has to do with the tending to the old structures, as you're saying, or midwifing. So yeah, I'm just kind of holding that too, right? Because this not seeing it as a rocket ship but going into the next phase, perhaps as a stage centric model would mean, the gathering up of time, right, of the future and the past and in the living present. And this being the sort of spiritual attitude, it starts to look kind of zigzaggy, as Charles Taylor likes to use, right? It starts to look a little networky, right? Where that web is a sort of gathering of time, of past and future in the present. So I just maybe we could speak about that if you feel inspired to speak about that at all, right?
Yeah,
The
well,
sense of retrieval, as part of the future becoming.
you just touched off something for me in the process of what you were saying, that I remembered how Gebser begins the book, uh, is with that the story of how quickly, I think it was Cortez or one of them, waded into Mexico and just wipe people out of off the playing field, and without commenting from any kind of point of view about whether that was in the long run good or bad. The point he made was that the new structure of consciousness, the old culture that he met, which was still really working according to principles of a of a of a of a of a less lively, of a waning mythic, was not a match for the force of the new consciousness marching in. And all of a sudden, bells started going on in my head. That maybe that's the difference between when when Gebser wrote his book, like now 75 years ago, and where we are now, the seeds that have been culled. If this, when this integral structure is ready to kick into gear, there's a force at the beginning. I think that that's what Gebser is really saying strongly, and each new structure comes on like kerwham, like a northwest breeze after the air is cleared in a storm. And if that's the case, and if these 75 years since Gebser first gave his prophetic assessment, we've been gradually tilling the ground with the strengthening of the contemplative paths, with the strengthening of the artistic, with a science has given people a lot more ability now to see in terms of relationships moving directly, to grasp things that couldn't be grasped before. We've made a lot of kind of preparatory progress in the last 75 years. And I wonder if it would only take a critical number of people to step out of the wings and begin to strut the new being that's actually being engendered, to that it might have the disproportionate force of a Cortez to bring down a culture. You know, the mental structure is so hogtied and so effete and so sort of, you know, terminally impacted at this point, so terminally polarized, that it won't take much of a wind to blow it. I mean, you know, it's gotten blown from one side by Donald Trump. But imagine a wind blowing from the other side with the force of a new consciousness emerging on a new continent, uh, with a whole new way of doing it. And it's not like destroying the old, but it's so much like all of a sudden they are revivified and instantly reframed and reconstituted in the light of the new. So that would be my thank you for that inspiration. Over to you, Jeremy.
Oh, that's great. I mean, yeah, I think yeah, for me, I think that's very much what the point of my recent essay for the new book on reclaiming time. There's two parts. I think I've only sent you the first one. I'm just polishing the second one, but the whole idea is, you know, isn't it time we really begin to live the new, right? The as you described, the way to some degree has been prepared and intensified. And this is something we talked about again in class last Wednesday, right? That anxiety is the great birth giver, as Gebser says, right? That the or as I have entitled the last class, right, in the danger, the saving from Holderlin, right, the sense that the intensity of the crisis is generating a kind of awakening of the new, right? It's stirring the new out of its sleep, right, into an awakening. When that's an awakening, not into the mental, right, but into this intensified super wakefulness or lucidity, and we can take this to mean both, as you're speaking to, the contemplative's awakening, and then also a sort of world constituting form of being, right? Which by its event of awakening starts to reshape our reality. And what Gebser's saying, this has sort of been happening for 150, 250 or so years, right? This unconscious stirring of this new relationship with time, right? This integral time or time freedom. The energy of time freedom is sort of pushing and stirring and creating, perhaps you could say, these forceful conditions of crisis, not directly, as a result of like our sleeping, right? As a result of the mental world asserting its own place as, you know, the center. Well, this new integral energy is pushing into reality more and more until we awaken to it, right? So what happens when we awaken to that? What happens when we really begin to live the new and cohere? I do think we're kind of at the precipice here, particularly in the 20th century, as 21st century, as time itself has become this all suffusing reality, right? With the climate crisis, we can't avoid time anymore, as Holderlin talks about. Time now lies around in heaps, right? It's something we stumble upon. Or Eluard says, time, I sense time, space abolishing itself and time increasing in all directions. There's a sense in which time has become so intensified, even as a negative force, that there's a sort of catalytic awakening here. There's a stirring of a new consciousness and a new way of being. And to some degree, the complete and utter and total failure of the old in its institutions and its way of thinking and its spatialization of time, um, their exhaustive victory has created a place where the new actually can find a crack and break through, because there hasn't really been a victory, right? It's been a sort of totalizing capture. And so now at this point, I do think there's a move or a shift into quote unquote reversal, but it's a reversal that's not a regression, right? It's a reversal where time as a quality is really coming to the fore and really beginning to awaken. But just to kind of come around to the point that you're making too, um, I think part of our work in communities of practice, and this is how I frame integral futuring, is bringing that energy, that reality into consciousness, saying it's already shaping us, it's already everywhere. Our role, as it were, is to bring it to a new awareness, right? Is to bring the unconscious to the foreground as consciousness, as lucidity, as clarity. And then what comes about, I think, is exactly what you're speaking about, is an intensification and a kind of a quickening. What that looks like in a sort of material, physical, social, sociological sense, we could get into all of that, but we don't necessarily have to today. But I do think that's the hinge point here. How do we bring this into wakefulness in gatherings and groups as we have put together here? Not so much. There's a question you can certainly take. We can also begin to open it up and transition to student questions. But any thoughts on that before we do?
Uh, I think I've said about all I need to say at this point. I'd love to hear the questions and hear
Oh,
what
fantastic.
you people are cooking with out there.
Great, great. Yeah, and thanks everyone for tuning in and being patient, letting us riff a little bit here to sort of prime our conversation. So yeah, thank you, Cynthia, as well, for this has been such a joy to riff with you, and I hope we continue to get to do this. Um, let's go first to, I see John, you've got your hand up. We're gonna, as I said, go with student questions, and then we'll keep kind of spiraling around and opening up if there's time. So John, yeah.
Good morning, everybody. Uh, Cynthia, those were great thoughts. I've been following your work for years, and I wanted to veer a little bit off into the contemplative side and then tie that together with the integral for a minute. But like you, I was a member of various Gurdjieff groups, mostly in the 70s in Austin, Texas. And like you, I actually knew Father Thomas, not like you did, but briefly I knew him as a result of his coming back in the early 2000s, occasionally to the Church of Conscious Harmony in Austin, Texas, to give talks. And he was invited there. He was friends with Tim and Barbara Cook and Marianne Best and the Begemans. And I kind of got to know him just by being friends with Marianne Best, in that when he would come into Austin, she would give a small dinner party for him at her house. And 10 or 12 people or so would be invited. And uh, I would be invited just as a result of being friends with Marianne. And one time I found myself sitting next to Father Thomas at the dinner table. And I'm thinking, oh man, what am I going to talk to Father Thomas about? Here I am next to him at the dinner table. And just a very minute backstory here. Gurdjieff, apparently, from what I gather, appointed a man named John Pentland to be in charge of proliferating the Gurdjieff work in New York City. And so I was thinking, and by the way, at the Church of Conscious Harmony, the two things that they really relied on as their philosophy was the Gurdjieff work, they called it the work, and also the contemplative side with Father Thomas. So I'm sitting there and I asked Father Thomas at the dinner table, well, have you ever heard of the Gurdjieff work? And I'm thinking, oh man, he's not going to know anything about that. And he says, well, he says, I used to have coffee almost every week with John Pentland in New York when Father Thomas was at the abbot at the he was the abbot there in Massachusetts for some time, I believe. And apparently he knew John Pentland and they had coffee together on a weekly basis for some time. And it like blew my mind. My goodness, I had no idea about that. But I wanted to let you know that your work is filtering down and doing good. This particular book here that you wrote a few years ago. I have been at my Monday night contemplative prayer group here in Central Texas. I've been doing contemplative prayer for around 20 years. And at our Monday night group, I have been reading just a few pages, a couple of pages, because I don't want to bore people and I want to make room for everything else. But reading a few pages from that book at the Monday night meetings, because what I've noticed is that a lot of the newcomers to contemplative prayer groups don't know anything about Father Thomas. They don't know who he was, what he was about. They haven't read any of his works, but they're drawn into the contemplative prayer network, but they really don't know about Father Thomas. So I read a few pages from your book every week. I did last year to give them a foundation of the understanding of one of the three men that resurrected centering prayer from the dead, you might say. So just wanted to let you know your work is filtering down and having a good effect on us. So I appreciate all of that. Thank you.
Yeah, well,
Thank you.
thanks for John, and you got me. I didn't know that he'd had coffee with John Pentland, that smiling Cheshire cat that guy was, Thomas Keating. But I do think really strongly that one of the amazing things that if Gebser had been out continuing his job of collecting signs of the integral awakening seeding itself, uh, it would be hard to overlook people like Thomas Keating and John Main, who realized that one of the problems and one of the reasons that Christianity and Christian spirituality was so stuck was it was all mental. It had been entirely captured by the mental structure of consciousness, and the only break from that was in when it went into its wild kind of mythic and magical paroxysms out on the kind of fundamentalist and Pentecostal right. But it didn't have a practice that would actually shift consciousness. And in the simple realization that you could reclaim practices, and he basically took the baton from from TM, Transcendental Meditation, which was itself a gift from the East to the West. I mean, people in Asia had gotten onto this long before we do, that the West was stuck in its middle structure. So so Thomas and John Main, who was doing a similar sort of thing with a different path of meditation, actually got Christians meditating. And in the process of meditating, Thomas gave them a very, very interesting and intense study of attention. Uh, that he realized that whenever people's attention went out and stuck on a thought, that it would create and tend to recreate a mental structure setup. That the perceiver was inside the other, and he was trying to teach them in meditation in what he humorously called "take a brief vacation from yourself," a means of allowing enough space inside that a different system of perception could begin to seed itself, a different structure of consciousness. And this is particularly so in centering prayer, I think even better than the more mantric meditations. Uh, he got people used to it. And then in the end of his days, in the final 5 years of his life, he took the whole Christian mystical tradition, another wild ride down the pike, as he began to introduce people to something that he called unity consciousness. which was really, I think his unity consciousness would definitely be classed as an integral manifestation. That he wasn't talking about the classical description of unitive in the Christian tradition, that my deepest me is God. Unitive, the old peak was just to realize that you are not separated from God. Uh, and unity consciousness says, why use a kind of screen of perception that creates separation in the first place? Why can't you just see from oneness? And in his last work, particularly in the last 5 years that I write about in this book, uh, he's just taking people there and uh, blasting the roots of the middle structure as the seat of selfhood. He's not taking it out, and this is a really important thing to realize about Gebser work. The structures are not demolished; they're not dismantled. But they simply are allowed to move out of stage sitter. They don't become the hegemons anymore. So he was creating a functional new place, uh, uh, a new way of seeing, and then encouraging people to move their felt sense of selfhood away from their small mental self into something different. He wasn't using Gebserian language and he wasn't using Gurdjieffian language. He was basically using it within the context of the Christian tradition, using, and a lot of his students nowadays are very, very stumped. I mean, they like the old centering prayer where, centering prayer was the little medicine you used to help polish up your false self. And then you had your true self, which was your finite mental self minus its worst neuroses. He took them so far beyond that. And so he was really creating a path that people could walk on to actually practice their way into the new consciousness. And the Church of Conscious Harmony is one of the first places that meaningfully put together contemplative prayer and Gurdjieffian reference points in conscious awakening. So I'm glad, John, that you've been a part of it.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, thanks for that answer, Cynthia. I will refrain myself from any reflections here so we can keep going around unless I'm particularly asked to address something or if you want to pass the baton over to me, Cynthia, as we go along. But let's go to Linda.
Hi, hello everyone. I think it's quite beautiful.
Linda, I think is it just me? A little bit of a vibration.
Oh, do you know what that is? It's the washing machine running downstairs. It shakes the whole house.
Oh my goodness.
It must be wanting to come into the circle with us tonight. But it just feels quite special to me to have, it seems like 3 circles. I was excited to see Cynthia's community and also other mutant participants who aren't in this particular class but have been very loyal to learning from Gebser. I think this morning I was journaling about ideas, and I guess I just want to spill them out into the middle because I'm just wondering how sharing them might actually help me integrate them. So it's a little bit of a selfish act. But I am thinking about how, well, there was quite a few, but I think the central part was when I was contemplating this morning, for me, Jeremy illuminates the whole of Jean Gebser and also of his teachings when in his book Seeing Through the World he says, in a sphere, whether something is near or far is not a matter of distance but of attention. And I connect that, Cynthia, at least right now, with your teachings. I've not been in your community, but I have studied with you, participated from a distance, and I especially what you have taught about the imaginal is really to see that as a reality that's more real than what we see here, and to sort of feel into that more and more has been so helpful to me. But so there's this thing also with communities are really, in my at least in my awareness, coming to be more of a central part of how we live today. They want to come forward, it feels like. And there is this sense of this thought about in collective imagining and attention, when you see attention coming from this sphere where distance and time are of not importance, that I'm curious if this is a place where past, present, and future are not separated or mushed together, but are integral. And that feels, I don't know if there's any comments, but that's where I am right now. Thank you.
Jeremy, do you have any take on that? Yes.
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, I think just briefly, I love what Linda's saying about, communities are part of what wants to come forward in these times. I think that is very alive for me, and it's something I'm hearing spoken in different ways in different communities. There's the whole discussion right now about para academic communities, but in the para academic, there's suddenly room for so much more: aesthetic meaning making, connection making, big picture thinking, spirituality, soul, right? So I think that's a big part of this. But just in terms of a place where the past and present are not separated, but also not mushed, right? In the sort of magical sense of unified, right? And there's nothing bad about it, but that's just not the integral that Gebser is talking about. I would say this sort of spherical relationality, I think it does allow room for qualitative difference to say, well, this has the feeling tone of the magic, right? It allows the magic to be. I think presence and the spiritual present, the spherical perhaps present in terms of attention, allows for difference while also cohering the whole. And it's not something that we're mentally figuring out, right? The kind of intelligibility and distinctions, I think, arise out of the present. We're participating in a kind of mind at large, perhaps, or heart at large, right? There's something creative in that process of both distinction and wholeness. That's my sense. That the integral does allow that, right? And becoming present and turning towards the present through attention does allow that multiplicity to be affirmed without losing the sense of the whole, right? And that's sort of the fundamental new attitude, I think, of planetary culture, right? Or planetization, right? That there's a multiplicity of beings, a world where many worlds are possible, and yet there is still a world, there's still a whole that's present. That's just my shorthand remark, but yeah.
I would say that one thing that you have to be really, really careful of when you use the community word is to not let it get captured by middle structure, and particularly deteriorating middle structure, hooks. That imaginal community is about synergy. Period. It's not about belonging. It's not about showing a massing of your strength. It's not about supporting your beliefs. It's when people are clean and clear and centered and spacious in their own being, the community forms. And then what happens is that you begin to develop a unit with the emergent properties. The whole is bigger than the part. And the thinking and the generation of ideas and the amplification of energies happens. But the moment that you try to cling to it or organize it or need it, it turns and starts chasing you. So we have to be really, really, really clear. It's obvious and clear that you really can't have an integral without community. But we also need to be very clear that integral and imaginal community does not even need to know who all is in it. Uh, because I mean, we may have some people in the community on Mars for all I know. It could be everywhere, and it need to be nowhere. And if you never see the people again, you don't have to send them Christmas cards, uh, because there's something else that's holding it, and you have to trust that holding. Uh, I'm just looking here at a question that may come to it that came up in the chat. Julia asks, as a full-time activist leader in my community, I'm finding it hard to maintain. I struggle to maintain my rootedness in this work, conscious of midwifing the integral with the cruelty and intensity of the moment we are in. Any tips on maintaining presence in these fraught conditions? Uh, all I can say is that's the real great question. Presence has to be the higher value. And because if you can't maintain presence, you can't, you got nothing. I mean, if it scrambles you, and I think that's part of the challenge of this era. I almost think that our pet mascot should be the Sphinx that knows how to look upon without cracking. And it requires, when you talk about capaciousness, this is it all over the place, because we have such small, overwrought, over-personalized nervous systems nowadays that we can't take it. We get undone, we get sucked in, and we get depleted. And somehow, if you did nothing more than practice your centering prayer or whatever kind of meditation practice you use for 20 minutes a day, but during that 20 minutes, do not allow yourself to be taken. If you get anxious, if you get fearful, come back to your sacred word, come back to, and learning how to keep a critical mass of presence. If you can't remain present in the situation, you have to move off from the situation a little bit till you've regained it, because it's your presence is what you're going to bring as the vehicle through which the force will come. So I think this is really, really strong work for most of us, and it's work that's not being done in the middle structure of consciousness, but it's learning the skills of that presence, surrender, and right timing make a kind of triangular knot, and you have to have all three of them to know to how to move in a moment. But when they're all there, you know how to move. And when one of them's lacking, your moving gets a little bit wobbly. So, really, really good questions.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, thank you for that, Cynthia. Just to echo what you're saying with Gebser, I think he speaks of this too, right? Where even when we're working on the structures and we're trying to make them living realities in us to really come in contact with them in a concrete way, he also is essentially pointing to the danger that they're going to hijack us. There's going to be, submersions, psyche awakens, right? The soul awakens, feelings flood us, images flood us. So for him as well, his term is perhaps maybe a little bit less distinct because he's not coming from a contemplative tradition, but he talks about a certain detachment being needed as you really engage with the structures concretely, right? I would say, and I tend to say equanimity might be a better word, right? Because you really, as you're saying, the contemplative's capacity, like the Sphinx, to be present, to really be there for the full vividness of the structures without getting kind of pulled into them in a way where you lose presence. It's a really good, I think, rule of thumb, right? Because we're not talking about wakefulness, we're talking about presence, which has this capacity to be present to wakefulness or present to the magic or the mythic structure. But at the moment we're either joining magically or mythically kind of undergoing being drawn into the experience without being able to think about it anymore, or we're moving into abstractions, right? We're not being present. So being present, I think, has this sort of very clear, clarifying emphasis that I'm hearing in your recommendation. So yeah, thank you for that. That's also clarifying for me. Yeah, well, let's keep going around. Great to see so many hands up. Ben, would you like to jump in with a thought?
Yeah, thank you. It's been really a wonderful conversation. And I actually got into Gurdjieff through Peter Brook. I was involved with theatre stuff and his book, The Empty Space. And then it took it a further because a few weeks ago I mentioned the Dances of Universal Peace that I've been involved with, which has come from a Sufi tradition.
Mhm.
And that came out of Hazrat Inayat Khan, who was also in Paris with Gurdjieff at the same time in the 20s. And my whole entry, though, into a much more going beyond my mental consciousness was getting involved with Zen Buddhism. And because in one of your just reading in the Seeing Through the World, you talk about paradox and how Gebser talks about paradox. And of course, the Zen tradition has this koan thing that's about paradox. But then I found a lot of people in that tradition were just sitting on cushions and not necessarily acting in the world. And then I connected to Thich Nhat Hanh, who was basically teaching an engaged Buddhism that was about going into the world and from that point of compassion and understanding and presence. But the thing that really excited me was then there's this film called Meetings with Remarkable Men that Peter Brook made. And it's about, I don't know if anyone's seen it, but it's the most amazing film. And it's set in somewhere like Afghanistan. And it's a gathering of people who are from a Sufi background, but looking at music. And the question is, who can make the valley sing? So it's very integral in terms of through using music as well as contemplation. And it's a fantastic film. And in the film, finally, after all these people perform, one fella gets up and actually makes the valley sing. And so there's a whole thing that I got through Gurdjieff about music, because he was very into music. And there's a local woman here who brought a Gurdjieff orchestra to Sydney some years ago, and I've been doing some work with her. And it's again that whole thing of the Sufi path and the Zen path, and how they're really very interrelated with the Christian mystical path. Because I also spent some time with Quakers doing non-violence training. I had a very good friend who was involved with the AVP work, and we were doing our Dances for Universal Peace in Sydney at the Quaker Hall for many years, and in quite a few places there's been that relationship between Quakers and the Dancers of Universal Peace. And the point about the dancers is they're a way of embodying integral consciousness. That's what I experience, because it just gets you out of your head into your body, and you're singing and dancing, but you're singing and dancing in all different languages. So it breaks down, the simplistic thing. So I guess I'm just really excited by bringing Gurdjieff into the story as well, because his whole thing about music and the way that the chakras relate to certain levels of consciousness, and the third, the musical scale that has a point of disconnection at the third and the seventh, and how that does reflect in musical practice that I do. So I'm just interested in bringing that sort of other side of the conversation in of how we can use music as a way, as well as meditation. Like I do both, and each one has its own place. There's this wonderful saying that the Buddhists sit so they can contemplate the dance, and the Sufis dance so they can contemplate the stillness. So yeah, so they're very related, even though they look like paradox. They're paradoxical, but again, that breaks out of the mental consciousness, which can't really deal with that paradox. So I'm just interested in anything you have your reflections about all that.
I have some pretty strong reflections, Ben. I thought almost since reading the book that what the Gebserian movement most needs, what Gebser most needs, is a compatible parallel practice. Because left on its own, it gives you this marvelous roadmap, but you can get sucked into the weeds in the roadmap with all the language. Once you master the terminality and diaphoneity and syntaxis, and it's like a new language, and it doesn't start to shift consciousness until you actually come and to add compatible practices. And once you do, it's a 1-2 punch. I mean, I've found that when you put Gebser together with the Gurdjieff exercises that are only now beginning to emerge out of closely wrapped, inner private inner sanctum containers, and people are having access to it. What it does is really reinforce. And of course, the Buddhist practices, any kind of meditation practice, I think is a non-negotiable for anybody who's doing work with Gebser. Otherwise, you're just going to get sucked into a middle stew. But in addition, in addition to the meditation practices, you also need the kind of specter of mindfulness practices that come from Gurdjieff, who's actually teaching you to do the integration. Because meditation practices can just take you out of yourself. And what integral is really about is embodying. How am I here in this first body, in this world, sincerely alive? And what Gurdjieff has done that I think is really wonderful has allowed me to begin to wonder if attention is the new time. And that what really intensifies when your concentration, when your attention sharpens and deepens, is that you do have all these things that that become possible without getting squished and confused. Uh, but it all comes, as Gurdjieff learned, from practices that embody, quicken, and discipline attention. And I think without that, you can't do integral. And it's the big problem with a lot of even the contemplative dimension. All my good buddies that are all saying don't be non-dual are trying to do the integral consciousness with the mental structure of mind and self-good because nothing's pushed them out. So I think that Gurdjieff and Gebser are, for me, a praxeological marriage made in heaven. I mean, they just so inform each other, and I never knew what integral really meant until I started seriously doing the exercises. Like, oh, whoa, this is creating the neuro rewiring that allows integral to emerge as an actual new operating system in my being. And it takes it way further than contemplative. So I would say that Thomas Keating and G.I. Gurdjieff would walk on either side of Gebser and allow this wonderful teaching to actually take root in your own body.
Beautifully said. Thank you, Cynthia. To echo Joel, attention is the new time. Another tattoo coming right up. But yes, and thank you, Ben. We're gonna keep going around as to make sure we get to everybody here, but just to affirm that, right? That just to give you another line from Rilke that Gebser talks about, but our looking ripens things, right? So presence has this ripening, intensifying effect. And I always kind of compare it with Zazen and Dogen, right? Where Dogen says, Zazen is the enlightenment practice, right? It is the enlightenment, it is Buddha nature. So doing this, like Gebser's emphasis and his innovation with neologisms like presentiation, right, is about turning towards the present, or preligio, again, is this obligation towards the present. So it just, all of this is sort of synergizing or affirming what you're saying here, that attention is the new time, that the time of the present is this integral time, right? Relational, entangled, etc. But we don't have to abstract it, right? There's an immediacy that's available to us, whether we have a particular traditional practice of contemplative, presencing or attention, or maybe if we're lucky, like Gebser, right, who has a bit of a contemplative, poetic predisposition. Regardless, right, becoming attentive, attending to the present is the orientation, right, the spiritual orientation of the integral structure, preligio. So just really want to, put that right there. It's really at the center of Gebser, even if he doesn't quite know how to unpack it for us, right, because of all this philosophical Germanic approach that he's doing here, right, with emphasizing these new concepts and terms, etc. Yeah, wonderful. We only got a couple more questions, so let's go to Beth.
Yeah. Hi, Cynthia. So, after reading your Substack post and all of the comments, yesterday, and there was tension, and I could feel that affirming and denying forces. And when I woke up this morning, there was such a presence of just love. And I was like, there it is. And it didn't come from me, right? It came from that imaginal realm coming. And so I just wanted to just say that, how that a presence and how real it is. And I had a sense also that it was coming from that Christic realm. And so I guess out of for a question, it's like, what the role of like the Christic realm would be in related to those Gebser structures of consciousness. So thank you.
Yeah, that's a good one. I'd say, I'd say first of all that just to affirm your own experience, not to be afraid of the struggle. And it's in the ability to bear the tension between the yes and the no that the new can emerge, and that the presence that was love. I I would say, and this is to sort of squish something in hideously in the last, 5 minutes or so of a thing, but I would say that when integral is fully established in us, we will be able to access that love. One of its capacities is it allows that to move more freely through it. That I think the integral is the bridge that, to translate that into Gurdjieffian language, that when integral is established, it opens our access to what he calls higher emotional center, which allows a deeper kind of feeling to come into things, a feeling of conscience, a feeling of unity, a feeling of wholeness. And when uh, when higher emotional center is on, which is I think what integral does, it in turn opens the gate for what you call higher intellectual center, which is where you see with genuine impartiality, and you feel with genuine depth, but not, you know, not overwhelming. It's a, it's, it's like what Rumi said, when I die to the angels, what I shall become, you cannot imagine. We can't imagine what that is because we don't have the hardware in place yet to do anything more than just bump into it. But but I would say rather than try and lose the freshness of what you've experienced and the manifest vibration and goodness of it, stay there with what you know. This is what I did. I struggled, I wrestled. Out of it came presence, presence filled briefly with love, this energy that we don't know what it is. But in a way, you can kind of taste that that's the force, that's the primordial cosmogonic force that's going to set things in uh, new ballpark. And to the extent that an integral selfhood allows you to bear that, and in some sense transmit it. And I mean transmit it like an innocent, because when we're working, we still don't have access to. We don't know what we're doing, but we participate in the doing of it or the it doing of us. So all I could say, Beth, is yes, what you hit into is good. Uh, don't kill it with too much theory, but figure, yeah, you're headed in the right direction.
Wonderful. All right, let's go to Douglas.
Hi, wow, what a conversation. I I find it incredibly rich. I think everybody here is also finding it that way. And I certainly hope that there will be opportunities like this in the future with all of us. It just gets my mind popping. I mean, things like duality and non-duality, dueling is such a paradox for me that I almost got stuck there. So what was it I wanted to talk about? It's hard to remember at this point. But I would add, before I ask my question, is to what Beth just said. It reminded me that I woke up a few weeks ago in the middle of the night and I was incredibly peaceful. I had never felt that way before. It made absolutely no sense that I should be so peaceful. And where it came from, I don't know. Why I got there, I don't know. It wasn't as a result of meditating or anything like that. And I even tried to disturb it by thinking about Trump and what's going on in Washington. And I couldn't, it didn't shake it. And I keep that in mind as a potential of the new integral consciousness, that a piece that is passes understanding, that kind of thing. So I just add that to the sense of Christic love, for instance. What I'd like to come back to is the self. And Cynthia, you just used the word selfhood, and as an aspect of an unfolding integral consciousness, perhaps. And it has seemed to me, and I might use the word self-sense in here too, how we know ourselves to be ourselves, how we sense ourselves to be ourselves. And it has seemed to me that we really need a mutation of this consciousness of ourselves in ourselves, that the situation requires that to move on. And how to try to effect that. Everybody here, I think, is probably already in that process, but how do you transmit that? How do you take it out there? I mean, um, every time I was excited about something that had to do with a new kind of self-awareness in my youthful idealism, and I would try to convince friends and others that, wow, there's so much going on here, and there's so much in us to be realized, and so forth. And I would get blank stares or people would leave the room and thought I was really going overboard. Because I think it was threatening. It threatened the dissolution of their sense of self. And any change to that is felt to be dangerous. I even have a friend who uh, lost her son to suicide. And she's in such a state of depression, as can be totally understood, but she will not participate in um, in things that will help transform this for her. And what she says is, they will just try to change me. So she doesn't want to feel like her sense of self, even in its deep grief, um, should be changed in order to get past that, to see beyond it, and so forth. And I tried to make my own parents, who were sort of embedded in a cultic, um, right-wing religious sort of setting, to see beyond that sense of self that they had that was so identified with that setting. I could not. I totally failed in doing that. And then in the process, I became um, evil for them, basically. Demonic in a way. So how to work with this aspect of ourselves, our self-awareness, our self-sense, vis-a-vis the unfolding integral vision of selfhood.
Well, let me try and take a quick crack at that. And I know we're getting down toward the end of our time together, but every structure of consciousness has its kind of analogous or compatible its characteristic form of selfhood. And without going through the whole history of Gebser and what selfhood was like and the magic and the mythic structures of being, what he says very clearly, and we can validate this in our own life, is that the middle structure is the home of the hypertrophied ego. Uh, and that is to be that we have a very, very strong granular sense of self obtained by this perspectival hardware we use, where we stand like an artist in front of the canvas and paint everything outside. So we have this real strong sense of us at the center. And uh, and that is a fiction. That is a function of the operating system of consciousness that we're using in the structure of consciousness we're using. And needless to say, when we get into the integral structure of consciousness, that's not the sense of selfhood that goes with us. And it's not like the big expansion. People try to have drug trips, for example, to see something bigger, but they don't have enough of a stable core of selfhood yet inside them to contain it, so it just destroys the egoic function. But what seems to happen when the integral kicks on is that selfhood, uh, while it still has a really firm inner core, it's held more spaciously, And the whole skills that we have in our being that we now identify as us become kind of the tools we use to navigate and integrate in the world rather than the seat of our identity. And so I would say, generally speaking, that if you had one word that you wanted to, that you would put to it as a starting point for making room for it to go, is spaciousness. And there's a lot of really, really good work going on right now by, particularly in the Buddhist quarter, of being able to grasp and taste directly the spaciousness in which the content of action happens, in which the content of selfness happens. Thomas Keating was doing that really brilliantly toward the end of his thing, and I talk about that in the book on him. But as we begin to make room around our our small self without devaluing it. But as soon as you realize that it extends beyond that nucleated perspectival view, the whole thing becomes like more of a firm center in an ever expanding, circle. It holds the whole circle. Uh, and I think that's the direction we're going. Probably your friend there, who I grieve for, I get her plight. I mean, that because in her grief, what she has is immediate access to her son in the way she knows it. And if you get more broad, if you make the room the practice would heal you, it runs the risk of saying, well, what if this makes me not keep feeling my son, it's like in the pain, the presence. So there's a kind of love there, and I can understand fully why she would be reluctant to change the structure that gives her access to the things she holds most dear, so she thinks. uh, and the first step towards spaciousness is always the sense of going away from what you're hanging on to for dear life, which you love because it constitutes what you think is your vehicle. uh, and somehow we just have to start to, there's no way to get through that to take the first step. And the first step is meditation. The first step is take a brief vacation from yourself. And if you only do it for 5 minutes, you're at least carving a little bit of space where this new one will kick in. We don't create the new sense of self. And the new self of sense does not lead the transformation. It follows as the fruit of the transformation. When you've carved more space, when you've done the rewiring, when you're allowed to actual practice and implant that larger frame in you, then your new sense of self is, oh, hell, here it is. Why am I like this all of a sudden? Because you tilled the ground. Uh, so yeah, I'd say that's one that's just going to be a chicken versus chicken and the egg, or the egg and the chicken, until you take the first step to get out of the cul-de-sac. Jeremy, how would you work with them?
Oh, beautifully stated. I don't know if I could express it in a clearer sense, but I do hear. And Cynthia, I know we're over the top of the hour. We have one more question. Maybe we could do that one and wrap up if you're good with that. I want to respect your time, of course, your clock time. Okay, but yeah, just on that point, as before we go to Lucas. Yeah, I mean, as you're saying, the hypertrophied ego, the mental structure is its home, the late mental structure. And I love your emphasis on the phrase perspectival hardware is helpful, right? Because as we talked about in class, it fixes subject and object, right? But subject, by fixing object, fixes itself in that arrangement, right? There's a fiction and a function, as you speak to, a necessary illusion of sorts. Deleuze also speaks about it in Bergsonism, right? That spatializing reality is part of what the mental structure does, right? Is what the intellect does out of necessity. But we don't want to make that be the arbiter of reality. There are other aspects of perceiving and seeing. And the problem with the late mental structure, of course, is that the vanishing point and perspectival spatializing collapses into a kind of deficient magic point, right? The deficient expression of the magic, where this perspectival narrowing becomes a kind of defense, like a point-like territory defending itself against the world. And not to speak too much of your friend, but just to what we see writ large right now in culture is this sort of collapsing into, the spatial attitude, moving from this sort of expansive phase, right, where it's conquering reality or spatializing the world, withdrawing into the point as a kind of fortress, right? The buffered self becomes armed against reality, right? And it sort of collapses into itself, with the I becoming a sort of uh, just sort of swiveling on its head here, right? Looking back and forth, suspecting things, suspicious, defending itself and its own preservation. It becomes a little bit like Sauron's eye, right? The perspectival eye. I think Tolkien's expression of Sauron is a very good expression of the sort of deficient perspectival mental. So, with the integral mutation, as you're saying, right, the transformation or the self that arises out of this is the fruit of this transformation, right? And we must till that ground. And the self is a new fruit. And the self is very much, we could describe it conceptually, but to live it is another thing, right? To really begin to live it and to open one's heart and to be, as Gebser describes, in a relationship of primal trust with origin and the present. It means to put down the guard of this deficient magic mythic point, and open our hands and our hearts back up to the world to say, yes, I will be changed, right? And I could be destroyed in this process by being vulnerable, but I could also continue to become, I don't know what I may yet become. We don't know what the body is capable of, right? So the integral is very much this attitudinal, not altitudinal, but attitudinal shift, right? Into engaging with the world again, right? Through the open palms, through the openness of the heart in the present, through being in relation in the present. It's a hard, difficult work. How do we do that? We have to really tend to that ground in ourselves. It's a deep, deep inner work. As Gebser says, we have to overcome ourselves if we are to overcome this outlive structure. It's a deeply personal work as well as collective. But anyway, that's what comes to mind for me. Cynthia, let's go to Lucas, if you'd like to have the final word or observation. And here,
Well,
Lucas.
yeah, thank you, Jeremy, and thank you so much for staying longer, so I can just also give my question here. Actually, I have so many. This is so rich and inspiring and everything, and touching in many ways. Maybe the question not to so I can't go into all of them. One was, Cynthia, I got so excited when you pointed to. So I'm a student of the Diamond approach, the Ridwan school, and when you mentioned those, the essences and the being qualities and that, so part of me is just super excited. Like, what does that mean for the integral consciousness structure? Like, is that a structure of those essential qualities that has a particular shape or something? Like in the Diamond approach, they have those wisdom vehicles, for example, that are structures of essence. So that would be one question. And the other was, you mentioned action, and the Quakers don't have this dualism of action and contemplation. And for me, that's a big one, so I know how to contemplate, and I had to learn how to act, and lately discovering the importance of will to bridge that. So I would be curious, what is a practice to embody those qualities in action? What are practices that lead towards acting from integral consciousness?
Okay. I'd like to say, first of all, Luke, that it's a very interesting question you raised about the relationship between the essence qualities in diamond work and what we're talking about here in integral. And I would say, because I know Hamid Ali, uh, and respect him and see that there's an integral being, if ever there was. For those of you who don't know who I'm talking about, that's the real name of A.H. Almas, who got the whole diamond approach started. He's a brilliant evolved soul, so he can hold it and he can actually see these qualities of being in the And as he stares into the silence, as he stares into the emptiness, as he stares into the, I mean, it's something he's seeing. It's not something he's thinking. Uh, and because he didn't do this, he can describe them as essentially crystallized substance qualities. Uh, but this is simply the fruit of his quality of consciousness. The danger is if you try to get into this and do it mentally and say, "How is this like this?" Uh, you may wind up getting in the weeds of more mentality. Uh, and so play with it. There's something that we talk about in a new kind of substance called intertextuality, which doesn't ask the question, is this the same as this? But it's rather, how do these two speak to each other? And if you keep that question alive in you, knowing that you love the diamond work and knowing that you've done some of this other work with contemplation and other paths, allow them to talk to each other, and the right response for you will unload somewhere in your being and you'll know it. uh, as for the last practice, what I'm going to say, and this may be a wild gamble, but I think in a way it may be useful. One of the very, very simple things that Gurdjieff does, and please don't fight with this, and please don't argue about why is it this way and not what this way. Take the setup he gives you, but he teaches us to take the old Greek Trisagian prayer that so many people are used to. Holy, oh holy God, holy, immortal, holy, undying one, have mercy on me. And to have mercy on me means to take me into this web, take me into this larger mercy that is yours. Uh, and Gurdjieff suggests do it in your body in this way. Oh, holy God, bring your attention into your head. And as you breathe in, oh, holy God, whatever God is for you, sense your head, sense its aliveness. Breathe in and then allow your air, sort of pour it into your head and think, oh, holy God, the three of them the same. Then, holy and mighty, bring your attention into your spinal column, that whole aliveness. And that second of the Trinitarian invocations invokes the second person of the Trinity, Christ, the backbone, the human, the denying, the thing one pushes across. Sense it. See if you can sense the aliveness of your spinal column. See if you can sense the prayer. See if you can sense the air coming together. And holy undying one, uh, sense in the region of your solar plexus, this remarkable, remarkable place where so many of the chemical and mechanical systems of your being come together. And keep the three going, the invocation of this third person of the Trinity, breath, the the sense of the aliveness and sensation of this part of your being, the sense uh, of vibration, the sense of the prayer, and then have mercy on me. Stand in your own skin and feel the aliveness of your own created being, the vibration that is you, flowing through the whole of you. Uh, and just work at this. If you can get beyond whatever attitudes you have towards devotion, what the point is to subtly embody and bring breath into vitalizing through the outer structures of your body, beginning to contact the inner structure of aliveness that's in your body and in your being, and to hypervitalize yourself, realizing that if just as all things in the world, if the Trinity was the original cosmogonic principle out of which everything that came into being is created, then that is in you as well. You, as a part of creation, are an instantiation, a sort of tiny little pixel of the whole relational cosmogonic practice that is life. And as you can really sense that in yourself, in the inner aliveness of your own subtle body, connecting the outer skull of your body to the inner aliveness to the infinite, then you walk in the world in a different way. And then you will see those structures and diamonds, and they will dance before your eyes like the sun on a fresh snowfall.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. Beautifully, beautifully expressed. I will perhaps close here. It feels like an appropriate, speaking of timing, when to make happen, when to let happen. That feels like the right time to allow this session to come to a close. I just want to thank you for your presence with us today and for our conversation and for taking this time to be present and to attend to the questions of this community and reflections. It's deeply meaningful and I think for many of us transformative. So my appreciation for you.
I'm going to sign off then, and thank you for allowing myself to spend a bit of Sunday afternoon with y'all. This beats church by a mile.
Fantastic.
We'll see you later.
Great.
Oh,
Cynthia,
what a brilliant session. Thank you. Thank you.
Right, thank you.
And thanks, everybody.
Wonderful.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all. Yes, I'll post the recording for folks who are not part of the class. That'll also go to Substack and Patreon. And hope to see a bunch of you Wednesday for our wrap-up class, Lesson 5. And next Sunday as well, we're going to be doing another conversation. This one really turning towards the magic and catalytic reads with Meredith Graves. So I'll be posting about that too for patrons and Substack folks. Thank you all. Thank you. See you presently. Take care.